Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The soil report came in at 3:40 station time, which was the hour Lira Senn had come to think of as the universe's preferred moment for delivering bad news. Not midnight, with its dramatic weight. Not dawn, with its implication of new beginnings. 3:40, when the body's defenses were lowest and the brain was too tired to cushion anything. She read the numbers twice, then set down her interface slate and looked at the ceiling of her field station for a long moment, as though the answer might be printed there by some merciful prior occupant. It was not. The northern quadrant's topsoil density had dropped another 4% in a single season. At this rate, the Aevar Science Council's most optimistic projection, a document already so hedged with qualifications it read less like a forecast and more like an apology, would need to be revised downward again. She knew what that meant. She had been knowing what it meant for 3 years, in the slow accumulating way of someone who has been given the same diagnosis in progressively clearer language. She made tea. The station's heating unit produced a sound like a small animal reconsidering its life choices, as it always did, and then eventually provided hot water, as it always did, and Lira stood in the blue pre-dawn dark of her kitchen alcove and thought about 30 years of dying ground and what came next. The tea was acceptable. The situation was not. What came next, as it turned out, was humans. The Council's decision arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a briefing document that used the phrase collaborative opportunity 11 times and the word crisis 0 times, which was how Lira knew the situation had become serious enough that people had stopped being honest about it. The Earth Terraforming Authority had offered a consultation partnership. The authority had, the document noted with the careful enthusiasm of an institution swallowing its pride, achieved ecosystem recovery, outcomes on 2 terrestrial bodies, and 1 orbital installation that Aevar Science had classified as non-viable. They had methods, they had specialists, they would send one. Lira's senior colleague Davin read the briefing, set it down, and said, with the dignity of a man who had spent 40 years in soil science, "So we've surrendered." "We've accepted help," Lira said, "from the species that nearly composted their own planet twice, and recovered it twice." Davin looked at her with the expression of someone who had made peace with being correct and simply wanted acknowledgement of the fact. "You're going to volunteer to liaise, aren't you?" "I already did." He picked up his tea. "I'm going to put that on your professional memorial. She meant well. She always meant well." She was promoted to lead liaison 2 days later, which came with a title, a modest increase in her resource allocation, and the specific quality of silence from colleagues that falls over a room when someone has said the true and uncomfortable thing, and then been rewarded for it. She practiced the consultant's name on the shuttle to the landing dock, Elian Ward, running the sounds through her mouth with the focused attention she gave soil composition breakdowns. Aevar mouths were not architecturally suited to certain human consonant clusters. She had spent an embarrassing 40 minutes the previous evening learning this. The transport dock of Aevar's second-largest research station smelled of recycled atmosphere and the particular anxious energy of an institution waiting to be judged. Lira stood at the arrival's threshold with her assistant Pale, who had already developed a look of preemptive diplomacy, so refined it could have been used for treaty negotiations, and watched the Earth Authority transport complete its docking sequence with the unhurried competence of a vessel that had done this several hundred times and found it unremarkable. Elian Ward came through the arrival's threshold carrying 1 equipment case and a field notebook, physical, paper, battered at the corners, that looked so out of place beside Aevar's standard digital interface slates that Lira's brain briefly misfiled it under historical artifacts. He was not what she had assembled in her imagination from the briefing documents, but she recognized immediately that this was her failure, not his, since the briefing documents had contained no physical description whatsoever, and she had apparently constructed one anyway from pure assumption. He looked at the doc, then at his notebook, then at her, or rather, at the small identification placard Pale was holding with the focused professionalism of someone who had been asked to hold placards in worse situations. Lira Senn. His translation module rendered his voice with a slight half-second delay that gave his words a considered quality, as though he weighed them before releasing them. Yes, she had practiced this moment. Welcome to Aevar. Perfectly pronounced. She was unreasonably pleased with herself. He nodded, glanced once more at the notebook, then looked at her directly. I read the soil reports on the transit. All of them. The last 6 years. Pale made a small sound that was almost certainly not a laugh, professionally speaking. We can schedule a full briefing for tomorrow morning, Lira said. Give you time to settle in, review the facility, adjust to the... Is the northern quadrant accessible today? She looked at him. He was already watching her in the way she would later understand was thinking, though it read initially as something closer to stillness, like an instrument waiting to be calibrated. She thought of the soil report. She thought of 340 and the ceiling of her station, and the numbers that had been declining while everyone argued about procedure. Yes, she said, Pale's diplomatic expression intensified by several degrees. The northern fields in late-season light were the color of silence. 300 square kilometers of pale, exhausted gray, stretching to the horizon under Aevar's wide sky, broken only by the skeletal frames of irrigation infrastructure that had been installed optimistically a decade ago, and now stood in the dead ground like monuments to a more hopeful time. Lira had been here hundreds of times. She had stopped seeing it the way a person stops seeing chronic pain, not because it hurt less, but because the nervous system learns, eventually, to simply carry it. Standing beside Elian Ward as he crouched down at the field's edge and lifted a handful of the dry soil and held it, she saw it again. He brought the soil close, turned it, smelled it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something low, and his translation module rendered it, after its characteristic pause, as, "Well, that's honest." Lira looked at the gray ground and then at the human crouching in it with his battered notebook and his single equipment case, and felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately classify. Not hope exactly, or not only hope, something more structural than that. The bioluminescent lines along her collarbones, faint and usually dormant through her working hours, began, without her permission, to glow. She clasped her hands behind her back and studied the horizon with great professional attention until they stopped. 6 months into the project, Lira had developed 3 new professional skills she had not anticipated acquiring. The first was the ability to explain Aevar institutional review procedure to someone who understood it perfectly and simply disagreed with it on a philosophical level. The second was the ability to do this without raising her voice. The third, which she considered the most impressive, was the ability to watch Elian Ward crouch in a test field at dawn, before the joint morning briefing had even started, and say nothing whatsoever about it. Because saying something would require acknowledging that she had also been there since dawn, and for reasons that had nothing to do with the mycorrhizal inoculant trials. The work had become, over those 6 months, the most consuming thing in her life, which was saying something, because her life had previously contained very little else. The hybrid formula Elian had proposed in the first week, adapting an Earth mycorrhizal network technique to Aevar subterranean fungal systems, a combination that her senior colleagues had received with the specific skepticism reserved for ideas that were either brilliant or catastrophic, had produced results in the northern test patches that she still found herself double-checking, not because she doubted the instruments, but because some part of her brain had lived so long inside the bad numbers that the good ones felt like a translation error. Green, there was green in the northern quadrant. Not much. A thread of it, a suggestion, but real, measurable, and increasing at a rate that caused the Council's projection models to do something they had not done in 11 years, which was point upward. Elian had not said "I told you so." He had said, reviewing the 3-month data with the absorbed focus of someone who had already moved past the validation to the next problem. The fungal uptake rate is slower than the Earth analog. We'll need to adjust the inoculant concentration for the next cycle. Also, I think your Eastern Basin water loss figures are worse than the report suggests. He had then looked up from his notebook and said, with the timing of someone who had absolutely no idea he was being funny, "Good morning, by the way." The water reclamation project had begun in the 3rd month, which meant that Lira had spent the 3rd month shepherding Elian's system design through the Council's formal review process, while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that the review process was not, in her private assessment, a mechanism for making good ideas feel tired before they were approved. The filtration architecture he proposed was unlike anything in Aevar engineering tradition, and the Council had responded to it the way it responded to most unfamiliar things, which was by requesting additional documentation. Elian provided additional documentation. The Council requested clarification on the additional documentation. Elian provided clarification. The Council scheduled a review of the clarification. Lira had, by this point, developed a slight involuntary twitch in her left hand that Pale pretended not to notice. The system was approved in week 11. By month 5, it was running at 62% improved retention in the drought corridor, a number that the Council described in its official communication as exceeding projected outcomes, and that Lira described in her private field log as making me want to sit down on the ground and just stay there for a while. The evenings had become their own separate category of time. Late in the field station, after the day's surveys were logged and the Council communications answered, there was an hour or two that belonged to neither of them officially and which they had both, without discussing it, begun to treat as workspace. Elian thought aloud. This had taken Lira approximately 3 weeks to understand and another 2 to stop finding alarming. He would be reviewing atmospheric data and begin narrating his own reasoning in a low, continuous murmur, half sentences, partial conclusions, questions addressed to no one. And she had initially assumed this indicated some communication difficulty and had very carefully not mentioned it to anyone. Then she had started listening. The murmur was not chaos. It was structure, moving fast, skipping the connective tissue of polished presentation and going directly from observation to inference to next question. She realized somewhere in week 5 of evening sessions, begun to follow it. "You're doing the thing," she said one evening without looking up from her soil analysis. He paused. "What thing?" "The thinking aloud thing. You've been circling the Eastern Quadrant moisture data for 11 minutes. A silence. "How do you know it's been 11 minutes? "I've been counting." Another pause, longer. "Why?" She looked up. He was watching her with the still expression that she now knew meant his full attention, which was a different thing from most people's full attention, in that it was genuinely undivided, without the background noise of whatever else a person was managing. She held it for a moment, then returned to her analysis with great composure. "Because the conclusion you're working toward is wrong, and I wanted to know how long it would take you to get there." He was quiet for 3 seconds, then, "Show me." She showed him. He looked at her corrected model, then at his own notes, then back at her model. Yes, you could have just said something. I wanted the data point." He smiled at that, not the polite professional acknowledgement she had catalogued in the first weeks, but the other one, the one that arrived when something genuinely landed. She had started, she was aware, to collect those too. She was a scientist. Data was data. He had been trying for approximately 2 months to learn Aevar. This had produced results that she would describe, if pressed, as enthusiastic. He had learned 3 words. The first was a standard greeting, which he pronounced in a way that technically meant the same thing, but with an emphasis pattern suggesting mild personal threat. The second was a term for collaborative fieldwork that came out sounding, due to a tonal error involving his translation module's gap in Aevar dialectical variation, like an obscure agricultural insult. The third was her name, which he pronounced correctly, and which she therefore pretended he had mispronounced in order to demonstrate the correction without having to account for why hearing it from him, said right, in his voice, produced the particular quality of warmth it did. Pale, who had witnessed the pronunciation lessons on 3 separate occasions, had taken to leaving the room when they began. He cited filing obligations. He had no filing obligations. They both knew this and maintained the arrangement with the mutual courtesy of people who have agreed not to examine something too closely. It was in the 5th month, on a Thursday evening when the moisture data had finally resolved, and the kettle was making its characteristic sound of mechanical reluctance, that Lira noticed the supply communication. Elian had stepped outside to take a field instrument reading, and his interface slate was open on the work table, and the message at the top of his log was flagged with an Earth Authority routing code. She didn't recognize, not unusual. Suppliers communicated through various channels, but addressed to a project subdivision she didn't have on her shared documentation index. She looked at it for the length of time it took the kettle to finish complaining. Then Elian came back in, and she handed him his tea, and she asked, with the ease of someone asking about the weather, how the replacement filter sourcing for the reclamation system worked. He explained it clearly. He explained it completely. Earth Authority Logistics handled manufacturing and distribution through a central hub, standard for proprietary filtration systems, delivery cycles quarterly, never been a supply issue. She nodded. She wrote nothing in her field log that evening about the routing code. She filed it, without ceremony, somewhere in the back of her mind, in the section she reserved for things that did not quite fit but had not yet explained themselves. Outside, the twin moons were rising over the eastern basin, and the recovered water caught their light the way healthy water does, and her bioluminescent lines glowed the whole walk home, steady and continuous, in the cool Aevar dark. The atmospheric processors came online in the 8th month, all 3 of them, across the most critically degraded zones on the planet's western shelf, and Aevar made a sound. Not a metaphorical sound. An actual, measurable, low-frequency resonance that the monitoring stations recorded at 600, and that Lira, standing in the field station with her morning tea and her data feed, initially mistook for equipment malfunction before she understood what she was reading. The processors were working. The atmospheric particulate density in the western zones had dropped by 19% in the first 72 hours of operation. The Council's lead atmospheric scientist sent her a message that contained no words, only a string of numerical data, and at the end, a single punctuation mark she had to look up, because it was apparently a very old Aevar symbol used exclusively to express the feeling of being surprised by one's own relief. She sent it to Elian. He replied 4 minutes later, "I've been awake since 400 watching the pressure readings. Also, your kettle is broken again." He was in her field station when she arrived, which had stopped being a surprise sometime around the 6th month when they had both tacitly abandoned the pretense that the project's center of gravity was anywhere other than her workroom. He was standing at the data wall with his notebook open, and the kettle was indeed producing a sound like it was renegotiating the terms of its continued existence, and the atmospheric readings were scrolling across the main display in long, clean columns of numbers that were, for the first time in the project's history, doing what they were supposed to do. 19%, she said, 21 as of an hour ago. He didn't look up from the notebook. The Eastern processor is outperforming the model. I want to adjust the calibration sequence on the Northern unit to match. The Council will need to approve the adjustment. He looked up at that. 3 stages, she said, with the composure of someone who had made peace with a geological feature. Documentation, review, clarification request. How long? If I file today and describe it as urgent. How long? 6 weeks. He looked at the ceiling with the specific expression of a man conducting a private negotiation with the universe. Then he looked back at his notebook. I'll write the documentation tonight. I'll file it as a Category 1 technical update, 4 weeks. He accepted this the way he always accepted her institutional navigation. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the recognition of someone who has learned that a different kind of expertise is still expertise. She found, still, that she liked this about him more than was professionally necessary. The council's public announcement came 10 days later and produced the kind of institutional joy that Lira had not witnessed in her career, which was to say the kind that made ordinarily restrained senior scientists use exclamation marks in official communications. The recovery data was real, and it was accelerating, and it was. The communications department declared in a public release that was read by most of the planet within 48 hours, a turning point in Aevar's environmental history. There were ceremonies. Lira was asked to speak at 2 of them and gave the credit at both to the joint methodology and the field teams and the council's institutional support and everyone else she could name, because she was constitutionally incapable of standing at a podium and saying I when the honest word was we. Elian was acknowledged in both ceremonies with the calibrated gratitude of a political body performing appreciation while managing narrative, which meant his name was said warmly, and his specific contributions were described in general terms. He did not appear to mind. She minded on his behalf, which she kept to herself. The evening after the second ceremony, they were in the field station later than usual, and the data was good. And she had fixed the kettle through a combination of technical intuition and percussive maintenance that she was prepared to defend as methodology, and Elian was attempting, for the 4th time, to correctly pronounce the Aevar term for atmospheric recalibration, which had a tonal component in the 3rd syllable that his translation module simply declined to assist with. Again, she said, he said it again. It came out sounding, due to the tonal error, like a reasonably confident declaration that the sky owed him money. Close, she said. That wasn't close. It was directionally close. What did I actually say? She told him. He set down his tea, looked at the ceiling, and then laughed, not the polite professional version, but the real one that she had started, somewhere in the 7th month, to consider a personal achievement whenever she caused it. She kept her expression composed with the effort of someone who has decided that composure is the hill they are choosing. You've been letting me say that to the field teams, he said. The field teams found it very charming. For 3 weeks. Pale suggested I correct you after the 1st week. I decided the data on team morale was still accumulating. He looked at her for a moment with the still, focused attention that she had long since stopped misreading. Then he said quietly, "You're terrible." "I'm a scientist," she said. "I collect data." The distance between that and what came next was not very large, and neither of them crossed it all at once. It was more that the space between them, over the following evenings, became a different kind of space, charged with the specific awareness of 2 people who know something is true and have arrived, mutually and without announcement, at the decision to stop pretending otherwise. There was no single moment. There was cold tea and late data, and the particular quality of being known by someone who pays the kind of attention he paid. And one evening, she told him that her bioluminescent lines were a biological inconvenience with no socially acceptable off switch, that her entire emotional life was essentially legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. And he said he found them the most honest thing he had encountered in his professional experience. And she said that was a remarkably low bar for a compliment. And he said he was genuinely uncertain if it was a compliment or an observation, but that yes, he supposed it was both, and her lines were glowing when he said it, which made the entire exchange exactly as undignified as she had always feared intimacy would be, and also, underneath that, something she had no clinical term for. What she did not know, sitting across from him in the blue light of the field station while Aevar recovered outside, and the data continued its long climb upward, was what came to him in the after-hours he kept to himself. The authority liaison communication arrived on the 14th of every month, routed through a private encryption channel, and formatted in the procedural language of infrastructure reporting. He read the latest one the morning after the second ceremony, alone, before she arrived. The dependency matrix was, per the liaison's assessment, structurally complete. Atmospheric calibration was authority-controlled. Nutrient supplement requirement would manifest in the second growing cycle. Water filtration replacement cycle locked to Earth manufacturing. The system was sound. The recovery was genuine. The planet would survive. The planet could not. The liaison noted with the bland confidence of someone summarizing a spreadsheet. Survive without continued Earth authority support for a minimum of 15 to 20 years. At which point renegotiation of infrastructure agreements could be initiated from a position of. And here the liaison used the phrase that sat in Alien's chest the way a piece of bad data sits in an otherwise clean dataset, strategic advantage. He filed the communication. He went to the northern fields and checked the inoculant progress. The green was spreading. He crouched and lifted a handful of soil that was nothing like what he had lifted on the first day, that had weight and moisture and the dark promise of ground that was coming back to itself, and he stayed there a long time, holding it. Then he stood up, brushed his hands clean, and walked back to the field station because Lira would be there and there was work to do, and both of those things were, in the ways that mattered to him, equally true. He found her already at the data wall, tea in hand, and she said without turning around, "The northern inoculant spread rate is up 6%. And he said, "I know, I just came from there." And she said, "I know, I saw you on the field monitor." And he said, "You were watching the field monitor at 600. And she said, "I was watching the inoculant data and you happened to be standing in it." And he looked at her, and she looked at the data with great professional dedication, and her lines were, he noticed, glowing. He said nothing. He sat down and opened his notebook and began the day's work, and the planet breathed outside, and the numbers rose, and he wrote everything down except the thing he couldn't. The document that undid everything was filed under the heading Supplementary Infrastructure Audit, Atmospheric Systems Maintenance Protocol Review, which was perhaps the most aggressively unreadable title in the history of Aevar administrative record-keeping, and Lira would later reflect that this was probably not an accident. She found it on a Tuesday in the 11th month, forwarded to her inbox by a junior council member named Sarit, who was 8 months into her appointment, and still laboring under the impression that her job was to read things carefully. Lira almost archived it. She had 17 other documents open, 2 field reports pending, and a calibration review to sign off on before noon. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. Then she set down her tea with the deliberate care of someone making sure their hands were steady, and she read the rest. It took her 4 days to complete the picture. She was methodical about it in a way that surprised her, because she had expected to feel something large and destabilizing from the first thread, and instead felt something focused and cold and precise, like an instrument recalibrating itself without being asked. She requested supply documentation through official channels, citing the audit review, which was true. She traced the nutrient supplement patents through the Earth Authority's public registry, which took 6 hours and produced results that sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. She modeled the atmospheric calibration dependency forward 10 years, then 15, then 20, using the processor's own technical specifications, and the model was not ambiguous. She ran it 3 times because she was a scientist, and because she wanted to be wrong, and because she was not. On the 4th day she sat in her field station at 3:40, the hour, she noted, with a dark and private humor that she had no one to share with, that the universe reserved for the delivery of things that could not be cushioned, and looked at the ceiling and made tea. And then she wrote Alien's name in her field log and stared at it for a long time. She did not write anything after it. She closed the log. She went to the northern fields before dawn and stood in the green that hadn't been there a year ago, in the soil that had come back from gray exhaustion to something alive and holding moisture, and smelling the way her grandmother had once told her fields were supposed to smell. And she stood there until the twin moons set. She told him on a Thursday, because Thursdays were their field survey days, and she was, even now, a creature of structure. She waited until the survey was done and they were back in the station, and the kettle had performed its customary protest and produced hot water, and she had set his tea in front of him. And then she opened her documentation on the shared display, and she let him read. He read without interrupting. This was, she thought, characteristic. He had always been a person who finished receiving information before responding to it, which she had admired for 11 months and was now experiencing from the other side of a very different kind of data set. When he reached the end of the dependency model, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you known?" 4 days. He looked at the projection on the wall. "You kept the Thursday survey." "The inoculant data doesn't care about my personal circumstances." A silence. Outside, the atmospheric processors hummed at their low, constant frequency, the sound Aevar had been making for 3 months now, the sound she had learned to hear as the planet breathing. He said, without preamble, without the construction of defense around it, "Yes, all of it. The dependencies are real and they were deliberate, and I am an authority operative and have been from the beginning." He looked at her. "The solutions are also real. I need you to know I'm not asking you to weigh those against each other. I'm telling you they are both true and I built them simultaneously, and I don't have a version of this conversation where that becomes something other than what it is." She looked at him for a long time. "Did you know," she said carefully, "when you held the soil on the first day in the northern field, did you already know what you were going to build into it?" "Yes." "And the green, the recovery, the atmospheric resonance, that was also real?" "Yes." "You loved my planet and you put chains on it." He didn't look away. "Yes." She stood up and walked to the data wall and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the atmospheric readings scrolling in their clean columns. And she thought about Sarit, who read everything carefully and had no idea what she had handed to her supervisor in a document formatted with the impenetrable tedium of infrastructure appendices. She thought about Pale, who was going to be absolutely insufferable about this, not because he would say anything, but because he would maintain such a precise and compassionate silence about it that it would be worse than words. She thought about her grandmother's fields and the gray and the green. She thought about cold tea and mispronounced Avery and the way he laughed, and the fact that none of that had been false, which was the part she kept arriving at and couldn't root around. "The calibration uploads," she said. "The atmospheric processors need them quarterly from the authority's technical division." "Yes, I'm going to learn the calibration system." A pause. "It's proprietary architecture." "I'm aware. I'm also the most qualified agricultural systems specialist on this planet, and I have," she turned around, "apparently 11 months of working with you and your methodology and your battered notebook, which means I understand how you build things well enough to eventually understand how to rebuild them without the parts that require Earth's permission." She sat back down. "It will take time. The nutrient supplement formula, I'll need a biochemist. The filtration parts, I know someone at the Eastern Manufacturing Institute who has been wanting a project. None of it will happen quickly." He was watching her with the full, still attention. "You're not going to dismantle the recovery." "No, I'm going to finish it." She picked up her tea, on Avery terms, slowly, without breaking what is already healing. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You taught me how the systems work. That was, I think, not entirely strategic of you." Something moved across his expression that she didn't have a category for. "No," he said. "That part wasn't." She nodded once. Then she said, because she was also a person and not only a scientist, and there was no sensor array in existence that could tell her what to do with that. I need time, with the other thing. I don't have a model for it yet. I know. I'm not telling you the model will be favorable. I know that too. Pale appeared in the doorway at that moment with the expression of a man who had absolutely not been listening from the corridor and required them to believe this. He was holding a data pad. He said with tremendous professionalism, "The month 11 atmospheric readings are in. The western shelf particulate density is down 43% overall." He paused, then, unable to help himself. "Also, the kettle is doing the thing again." Lira looked at Elian. Elian looked at the kettle. The kettle produced a sound of resigned mechanical dignity and then provided hot water because it always did, eventually. Pale retreated to the corridor with the bearing of a man who had fulfilled his function. She filed her first formal research request to the Aevar Science Council that evening. A long-term infrastructure independence study, framed as a natural extension of the recovery project, because it was. She listed herself as primary investigator. She listed the Earth Authority consultation as the methodological foundation, because that was also true. She sent it before she could revise the language into something more politically manageable, which Sarit would appreciate and Davin would describe at her professional memorial. Before she left the station, she stood at the data wall one final time and looked at the numbers climbing their long, slow climb upward. And she thought about what it meant to save something and bind it in the same motion, and whether the binding could be undone while the saving remained, and whether the person who had done both simultaneously was the same person who had stayed past midnight on 100 Thursdays to make sure the work was right. She did not have answers. She had a research proposal and a biochemist to call and a filtration engineer who owed her a conversation and a planet that was breathing on its own for the first time in 30 years. Imperfectly, dependently, stubbornly, alive. She turned off the display and walked out into the Aevar night, and the processors hummed their low note across the western shelf, and her bioluminescent lines glowed the whole walk home, steady and unguarded in the dark, which was not resolution, but was something. It was, she thought, a start.